Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today at this session on social economy satellite accounts. I'm going to share some slides, so I won't be able to see the Q&A as we're going through, but if there are questions, feel free to post them, and I will endeavour to try and answer them at the end of the session. Let me pop my slides up. So my name is Anushka Kenny. I work for an organisation called Pro Bono Economics, and I'm going to be talking today about lots of different titles for what this satellite account is referred to, but it's referred in some places to a third sector and social economy satellite account. It's also referred to as a non-profit and related institutions and volunteering satellite account. So that's the terminology I'll use today. Before I get into the sort of the main part of today's session, I just thought I'd say a few words about my organisation, Pro Bono Economics, PBE, and what we do. So PBE is a charity. We've existed for the last decade, and what we've been doing over that time is working with charities using the tools and skills of economics to help charities that want to better be able to understand and articulate the economic value of their programs. So the way we do that is we work with individual charities to help them develop their impact measurement and then translate that into an economic evaluation. And then over the past year or so, PB has expanded a little bit with the addition of an in-house research and policy team. And the objective of that team is to basically use the tools and skills of economics to try and draw some more macro level insights about the charity sector more broadly. So not focusing on individual organisations or programmes, but looking at the sector overall. And as part of that, at the end of last year, we launched the Law Family Commission on Civil Society, which is 2 years of research and policy work focused on the future of civil society. And that's particularly pertinent for today's topic because the Law Family Commission is really premised on the idea that civil society, although it is a very important and significant force in UK society, actually tends to get quite overlooked and undervalued. And I think that a part of the reason that happens is the way that the social sector is treated in public and national statistics. So that is why the topic of today's discussion is actually particularly important and pertinent to the work that PB is doing in the Law Family Commission. If you're interested in finding out more about that work, you can go, there's the Pro Bono Economics website here and also the Commission website. Do go and have a look. There's lots of interesting content on both of those. But particularly the Commission website has, among other things, some really interesting essays, including essays on social sector data that might be particularly interesting for attendees of today's conference. So, before we get into the meat of a satellite account, we need to start with some context. We need to understand what national accounts are because satellite accounts are essentially a sort of an adjunct to national accounts. So understanding where the social sector sits in national accounts is important before we can understand why a satellite account would be a useful investment. So the purpose of national accounts is to provide an integrated description of all economic activity within the UK. And the way that national accounts are built are they essentially draw on a range of different data sources. So that includes administrative data, so things like tax records, administrative data held by BEIS and other government departments and agencies, surveys, lots of different data sources, and those different data sources are pulled together and they are compared and contrasted And the idea is that by looking at sort of similar questions from different perspectives, the national accounts produce a single picture of the economy. And they include data on lots of things that you'd expect. So output, expenditure, and income activities of the main economic actors, so businesses, government, households. And they contain statistics like GDP is the one you expect to see, but lots of other statistics as well. So things like public sector net borrowing, household savings, household consumption, balance of trade. So lots of different things are covered in them. And the other important feature of national accounts is that they are built using internationally recognised standards. So there are standards sort of set by international bodies that set out how to build a country's national accounts. And that is really important because it means that the UK's economic statistics are comparable to those of other countries. So we can look at UK GDP and compare it to the GDP of India and France and Mexico, because we know that that number has been calculated in using the same methodology. So that is a really important feature of national accounts. So the next important question then is, how is the information in national accounts broken down? And this is getting to the core of what we're going to talk about when we talk about satellite accounts. So national accounts are organised using two main structural breakdowns, sector and industry. So sectors are based on two factors, the economic model of an organisation and also control. So is it controlled by the government or privately? And in its economic model, is it essentially a market or a non-market producer? So we talk about units in national account. A unit is just a thing that we count, so a business, a charity, a government agency, a household. Units that undertake production in the market, in other words, units that sell their products at a price that sort of covers their costs at least, they are assigned to the corporate sector. And that corporate sector is then subdivided into financial and non-financial corporations. The government sector, this is units that are controlled by government. So that includes government departments, agencies, local government, the devolved administrations, and then things like the state education system, the NHS, police, things like that. We've got the household sector, which is people, households, and that covers both consumption and production. So self-employed people are captured in the household sector. And then the bit that we're really interested in today, the non-profit institutions serving households, or the NPIsh sector. Now, units that are not market producers and are not controlled by government are captured in NPIsh. So essentially, these are organisations that provide goods or services either free or below market prices, and essentially they mainly derive their income from things like grants or donations, and they're separate from government. So that is lots of charities, trade unions, religious organisations, universities, things like that. But there are limitations on this, and that is what we are going to come to in a moment. We also, sort of national accounts, and in fact lots of government statistics are also broken down using something called the Standard Industrial Classification Code, or the SIC code. And SIC codes basically tell you what a business or an organisation actually does. And they sort of help us see how different industries are faring in the economy. So here we've got examples. This is just a handful. There are many more, but agriculture, construction, education. So this is about the activity that an organisation does. And this is just one example of a chart that I pulled out of an ONS report, which shows us sort of how different industries are contributing to output growth. SIC codes are used, for example, in the fortnightly business insights data that's been collected throughout coronavirus. So that tells us, for example, how many businesses in different industries are temporarily closed, how many are currently experiencing a lower turnover than usual, how many months reserves they have in the bank. There are loads of really interesting information at this industry level. So, big question, where is the social sector in satellite accounts? So, basically, charities, and certainly the social sector more broadly, are pretty much impossible to pick out of national accounts currently. And that is because they adopt different revenue-raising models, and they also work across industries, which are the two ways that national accounts are broken down at the moment. So how sort of working out where a charity sits in terms of sectors depends on how much income it earns, as opposed to receiving from grants or donations. We have something called the market test. So the market test determines whether a unit is placed in the corporate sector or the MPISH sector. And essentially, if a charity earns 50% or more of its income over a 3-year period, rather than being allocated to the MPISH sector, it gets allocated to the corporate sector because it's classified as a market producer. And this is pretty important because it basically means that even if you're a non-profit institution, that doesn't mean that you're not allocated as a non-market producer. And a really concerning outcome from this is that as more charities increase the amount of income that they're earning, so whether that's selling goods, tickets, memberships, or whether that is, for example, being contracted to deliver more government services, the contribution of the MPISH sector to the overall economy actually appears to decrease because MPISH shrinks because more charities are moving into the corporate sector. And of course, social enterprises that are entirely generate their own income are going to sit in the corporate sector. And in fact, sort of research has suggested that MPISH tends to only capture about half of the actual contribution to GDP of the non-profit sector. And in some countries, I think in Canada, that the non-profit sector was as much as 5 times as big as the MPISH sector in national accounts. So this is pretty important in terms of MPISH underestimating the size and the value of the non-profit sector. I should also say that there are some more confusing cases where we have non-profits that are charities, but they have a connection to government. So, for example, the British Council is a charity, but it's sponsored by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. They would actually be allocated to the government sector. So you can see here that businesses clearly fall into the corporate sector of national accounts. Government sits into the government sector, households and households, but non-profit organisations sit across a whole range of sectors in the national accounts. So the other kind of important element of this is that non-profits naturally sit across industries because they work in different areas, they work on different issues. Most charities are probably more likely to be found in this human health and social work sector, this arts and entertainment, or in education. But obviously, they're spread across those sectors, and they're mixed up with lots of other mainstream businesses that are working in those areas. And thinking about social enterprises, it gets even more complicated. I mean, Hackney Community Transport, for example, would sit in the transport sector. I suppose one of the challenges here is that we're essentially trying to fit round pegs into square holes. This system, this industrial classification system, was not designed with non-profit organisations in mind. So we can allocate non-profits using SIT codes, but this taxonomy doesn't really have a great deal of explanatory power for the non-profit sector. So the other question in all this is, where does volunteering sit in national accounts? So you might have heard this quote at the top of the slide before, essentially saying that GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And that is something that is often cited in debates around whether GDP is an appropriate measure for the success of our country and our economy. It doesn't capture things like well-being. It doesn't capture things like environmental damage or progress. Controversially, it does include things like drugs and prostitution. But certainly one really major omission from GDP is that it doesn't actually include volunteering. There's a slight caveat to that in that sort of direct volunteering work that produces a tangible physical thing at the end of it, that thing would be counted in national accounts. But apart from that, volunteering work isn't included in the national accounts, and therefore it's excluded from our GDP estimates. And that's not a small omission. The ONS estimated back in the sort of 2015 that formal frequent volunteering, so volunteering through an organisation, is worth around £23 billion a year to the UK economy. And similarly, sort of informal volunteering, so that's things like helping your neighbours with their shopping or their dog walking, is worth a similarly large number. So that's a sizable proportion of GDP that is missing. I'd also just say as an aside, of course, unpaid labour, particularly sort of domestic help and social care, is also not included in GDP, and that is estimated at around, I think it's £1.25 trillion, which is about 60% of GDP. So volunteering is missing, as is unpaid domestic support, and there are certainly many shortcomings with how or sort of many things that GDP doesn't capture, but volunteering is one of them. Incidentally, these numbers that I've got on the chart here were estimated from a household satellite account that the ONS did put together around 5 years ago, and they haven't repeated it since. So it doesn't feel like valuing volunteer work is very high up on the government's agenda at the moment. So just to conclude this section, only social sector organisations that are allocated to the NPISH sector are visible in national accounts as a non-profit sector at the moment. So all other organisations, that's all charities that earn more than 50% of their income, cooperatives, any social enterprises, they're all hidden across other sectors. And social sector organisations are spread across industrial codes. So a bit like a jigsaw with pieces of the sector in different places. The question is, can we put that jigsaw together? So now I want to talk about a methodology that has been developed by the Johns Hopkins Center for Civil Society Studies in the US. It's approved by the UN. It's been adopted by nearly 30 countries worldwide already. And it would allow us to essentially see the social sector within national accounts. And I'll use this, the terminology they use, which is non-profit and related institutions and volunteer work. So first of all, what is a satellite account? So we've talked about national accounts, but what are satellite accounts? So satellite accounts are developed by the same statistics agency that developed national accounts. So in the in the UK, that would be the ONS. And they provide additional information on top of the core national accounts. So links are maintained between the satellite account and the central national accounting framework. And that is important because that is what enables this new information to be presented alongside standard economic measures like GDP. So satellite accounts tend to analyse specific areas of the economy, and they use additional data sources. They might use alternative classifications to those used in core national accounts. And they tend to either bring out hidden detail within the current national accounts, or they look beyond the boundaries of existing national accounts. So, for example, looking at the value of something like unpaid labour or environmental resources. The UK currently produces 2 satellite accounts, the environmental satellite account and the experimental tourism satellite account. The environmental account measures the contribution of the environment to the economy. It also looks at the impact of economic activity on the environment and society's response to environmental issues. So lots of additional information in there. It also includes things like greenhouse gas emission rates. And the ONS also produces, as part of this, a natural capital account, which estimates a financial value and a social value for the natural resources in the UK. And the tourism satellite account basically tries to capture and measure tourism consumption and employment. So sort of basically how much money and employment is generated by tourism to the UK. So the non-profit sector, as we've seen, would be a pretty good candidate for a satellite account because it is contained within these national statistics, but actually it isn't visible, but it is countable. It is something that we can count. And the purpose of an NPI and volunteering work satellite account would be to create a comprehensive, systematic, reliable, and internationally comparable picture of sort of the non-profit or the social economy, including volunteer work. So just to really clarify here, this isn't just about new data. This is about data that is consistent with and comparable to other national statistics. So why do I think we need an NPI and volunteering satellite account? So I've started here with a quote from Lester Salomon. Lester Salomon is one of the main architects for the methodology about how to build an NPI satellite account. And he's also one of the main proponents for its adoption globally. And he talks about a non-profit satellite account providing valid and reliable statistics that will enhance the visibility and the credibility of voluntary organisations, contribute to improved transparency and accountability of the sector and of government, and provide empirical evidence for decision-making and policy development. So in a way, an NPI satellite account is a means to an end. And while one of those ends is insight and evidence for policy, another is more accurate national statistics. So this is kind of about normalising and standardising data about civil society. And that is a really important element of this. Having the ONS, having the UK Statistic Agency, developing and owning measurements of the social sector in the UK. And that will naturally, therefore, contribute to visibility, credibility, and legitimacy for the sector. So you've no doubt heard the phrase, what gets measured gets managed. And currently, we just don't know what the social sector contributes to the UK economy. So yes, of course, that contribution is much wider than just its economic contribution, but tracking the economic impact of the sector and normalising its measurement as part of the process of putting together national accounts is a really important step for raising its profile as a substantial force in the UK, something that is important, something that is worth measuring, it's worth tracking, and sort of giving it greater parity of esteem, if you like, with other sectors. This, of course, therefore means that we have a better understanding of the sector and increased transparency about what's happening. So we have better information about the size and the strength and the growth of the sector, and its contribution to the wider economy and how that is changing over time. And that in itself will provide the basis for evidence-based policy making. So helping policymakers to assess and track the impact of policies aimed to strengthen and grow the non-profit and volunteering sector, and therefore increasing the contribution that the sector can therefore make to improving people's quality of lives, well-being, addressing social challenges, environmental challenges. So, there's a natural feed through here from measuring to actually getting better outcomes. And similarly providing better data for researchers who want to explore the role that the non-profit sector makes, the sorts of challenges they face and how to strengthen their capabilities. And this absolutely includes things like spotting trends or problems that might need policy intervention, and potentially, depending on how the satellite account was built, it could include better understanding the regional spread of non-profit organisations, how funding is flowing, how volunteering activity is spread. But at the very least, it would generate a suite of ONS accepted methods for measuring the sector. And those could then be used in local and subsector surveys. So even if the ONS didn't choose to get into a lot of detail about the regional spread of the non-profit sector, and by developing tools that they accepted, they would provide the tools for researchers who did want to dig into those things in more detail. And this, of course, the other thing that we get from this is, because this is an internationally fixed method, sort of agreed methodology, it would allow us to compare the strength and the contribution of the UK's non-profit and volunteering sector internationally. So that could provide a very useful benchmark, particularly, for example, if the UK government believed that the strength of the social sector plays a really important part in the UK's progress against the SDGs, or has an ambition for the UK's social sector to be a world leader. But I will just sort of reiterate that, in a way, the most important part of this is this first point, that having normalised, standardised data that puts the non-profit sector on an equal footing with other parts of the economy is really key here. So what would actually be captured in the satellite account? So I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that despite their diverse organisational and legal forms, for the purposes of national accounts, actually, their diverse revenue raising models, non-profit institutions and volunteering work all share some very distinctive features that really distinguish them from other sorts of units in national accounts. So we know that they are driven by social mission. We know that they are prohibited or limited in distributing their profit. They usually provide some sorts of goods or services on a non-market basis, so sort of free or below cost. Their staff normally include volunteers. And on the other side, they're organisations that often benefit from certain tax advantages or are subject to different legal or regulatory frameworks. So they are unique organisations. They're just not unique in the terms to use to differentiate organisations in the national accounts. You can actually read, as part of the Law Family Commission on Civil Society, we just published a short paper on how we're defining civil society for the purpose of the Commission. So you can have a look at that if you want some more detail. But in the UN's handbook on how to build one of these non-profit satellite accounts, they use something called the structural operational definition to identify relevant organisations. And that is based on features, as I say, that aren't otherwise captured in the way that national accounts are organised at present. So organisations are considered to be part of the non-profit sector if they make a reasonable showing of these 5 categories. They have to be organised, they have to be an identifiable thing, they have to be private, they have to be institutionally separate from government. They need to be non-profit distributing, or at least subject to some significant limitation on their distribution of profit. They have to be self-governing, and they have to involve some degree of voluntary participation. The handbook also has a definition of volunteering, which is set out here. And then the types of organisations that would tend to be captured by these definitions include charities, cooperatives, mutual sports clubs, research institutions, religious organisations, and lots of social enterprises, along with both direct and organised organisation-based volunteering work. So what would we actually learn from an NPI and volunteering satellite account? So it would highlight lots of information. One really important thing is it brings together civil society organisations into one place. So So, we have sort of charity commission data on the charity sector, but this would bring together co-ops, mutuals, trade unions, charities into a single data set. And it would tell us the proportion represented by the non-profit and volunteering sector and over time. It would tell us some things about kind of how financially healthy or vulnerable the sector is, how many organisations by different it would also tell us some things about employment. So it would tell us about the number of people working in the non-profit sector. So that's both paid employees and volunteer workers. Tell us things about and it would tell us to what degree the sector relies on paid versus volunteering work. Tell us things about the value of volunteering work, and it would certainly tell us how the UK's non-profit sector stacks up internationally. Now, to a degree, lots of this stuff is captured already in things like NCBO's Civil Society Almanac. But my understanding is that the satellite account would really lean on the Almanac and the Charity Commission, or the Charity Commission data. That would be a big source for a lot of its content. But as I said, it also looks beyond just general charities. It includes methodology which would provide guidance on how to get better, more reliable data about the workforce and about volunteering. And as I keep repeating, the fact that it's owned by the ONS means it gives us an understanding of how the non-profit sector actually fits into the national picture. What I will say is, while satellite accounts methodology tells us about the direct economic contribution of the sector, it wouldn't allow fiscal value or well-being value from what it is that the sector provides. And this is really sort of the core of what PBE does, is trying to look beyond just sort of the pure numbers about in and out of an organisation to looking at the value that a programme or a service generates beyond that. So, for example, work that we've done on school breakfast clubs, it's a huge financial benefit to these clubs when you take into account the fact that to help children stay in school, reduce truancy, pay more tax. So those things wouldn't be captured in the satellite